in the joining letter is an Anglican priest serving an Anglican URC LEP in Hodge Hill, which is in East Birmingham. And he's a very good friend to the Methodist Church. He's co-author of a book with Ruth Harley, which is called Being Interrupted, Reimagining the Church's Mission from the Outside In, which I know a few members of Synod have already read and is really recommended. And his title is When Things Fall Apart. You've already heard that from Chris this morning, and that's taken from the poem that I chose to begin Synod Calling Letter with. So Al, we're in your hands. We welcome you, and we're looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Rachel, and lovely to see some of your faces, and a real privilege to be with you all this morning. I'm going to try and share my screen and see if that works. Can everybody see my title page? Can you give me a nod? Brilliant, good stuff. So I want to begin with a story. It's a story that was handed to me by a friend from Ireland, but originally comes from West Africa. It's a story about a village that was hit by a crisis, and the elders of the village got together to try and work out what to do. And they decided that what they needed to do first was they needed to go and ask the wise woman for help, the wise woman who lived in a hut just outside the village. And so a delegation of elders went off to see the wise woman, and they asked her to come and help them. She agreed, and she told them to go and assemble the whole village under the big tree. And so they rushed off and they gathered the village together under the big tree, and the wise woman came and addressed them. And she said this: "I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Do you know what I'm going to tell you?" And one by one, the villagers scratched their heads, and each of them, to a man and woman, said, "Well, no, we don't. That's why we asked you for help." And the wise woman said, "Well, I'm sorry. In that case, I can't help you." And she went away. The elders at this point were a bit frustrated because that wasn't how it was supposed to work. So they came together again, and they decided that they would try again with the wise woman. So the same delegation went back to the wise woman and begged her to come back. "We really need your help," they said. And she agreed. And this time, the delegation rushed on to gather the village together again under the big tree. But this time they told the villagers quite sternly, "Give her the right answer." And so the wise woman came back and addressed the village again under the big tree. And again, she said this: "I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Do you know what I'm going to tell you?" And the villagers scratched their heads again. And in their heart of hearts, they knew the answer was still no, but they'd also had a firm telling off, and they knew that they were supposed to give the right answer. So they assumed the right answer must be yes. So again, in turn, each of them said, "Yes, yeah, we do know." And so the wise woman said, "Well, in that case, you don't need my help." And she went away. By this time, the elders are pulling out what remains of the hair on their heads with frustration and a certain amount of desperation, until one of them came up with a cunning plan. And so a third time, the delegation went to the wise woman's hut, and they begged and they pleaded her to come back and help the villagers. And a third time, the wise woman agreed. And this time, the delegation went and gathered the village together under the big tree, and they briefed them thoroughly on the cunning plan. And so the wise woman came, and a third time she said to the villagers, "I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. Do you know what I'm going to tell you?" And this time, half the villagers said no, and the other half of the villagers said yes. And the wise woman smiled, and she paused, and then she said, "Well, in that case, talk to each other." And she went away, and she was never seen again. So, my first question for you all, and if you'd like to put some comments in the chat, that would be brilliant, and we can maybe pick out one or two for you to speak and we can hear your voices. What wisdom do you hear in this story? What wisdom do you hear in this story? Pop some comments in the chat, and there are no right or wrong answers on this. Gabriel, you already have the answers you need. Thank you. What else? Are we asking the right question? It's all in the conversation. Communication is key. Never pretend to know something if you don't. Thank you, Denise. You can solve a lot of problems by communicating well. You can't do anything on your own. Searching and looking for answers within and amongst ourselves before we look outside. Thank you, Nancy. We all have a part to play. You are wiser than you think. That's Karis. Listen to the woman. Yes. Between us, we know what we should do. We're not good at listening to each other and acting outside our comfort zone. Big ideas come from big trees. That's Joanne. There's still space to draw more wisdom out of that story if anyone else has got something that they heard in it. Julia, we need to want change and be willing to be part of it. Keep trying. Thanks, Andrew. Listen to each other. Yes, it's Martin. Simplicity works. So if there are more on the tip of your tongue, then do please keep sharing in the comments. And many of you are, that's brilliant. Thank you. But I want to just draw one thing out of that story for the moment. And it is that, like the wise woman, and I'm not claiming her wisdom, but like the wise woman, I'm not going to tell you anything today that you don't already know. What I'm going to attempt to do is maybe point you to some of the things that you know already, and help us reflect together and draw out some of the wisdom that you have between you. The village of the story had been hit by a crisis. We don't know what, but we are familiar with that experience, I think. We are living through a time of multiple crises. If we had longer together, I would invite you to name some of them between us, but save a little bit of time. Perhaps I can name one or two that I hope resonate for you. And perhaps again in the comments, you can name others that I might have missed. We're living through ecclesial crises in the church, particularly institutional anxieties about survival and about purpose. Are we going to be around in another 10 or 20 years? And what are we for? What are we about? Why are we here? We are, and I started preparing this talk at least a couple of weeks ago before the latest of our national crises. We are living through a multitude of national crises about who we are as a nation and what we are about. Brexit perhaps was one of the pinnacles of that national identity crisis, but it unfolds in all kinds of different ways. We're living through a crisis of democracy. We're living through a crisis at the other end of empire and its legacies, not least in terms of racism. We're living through a crisis of inequality in our nation. The current cost of living crisis, which is both national and global, is as much a crisis of inequality between the haves and the have-nots and the growing divide as it is about energy and other things. And then we're living through global crises too. The global COVID pandemic and the wake of it that we all continue to live with and its after effects. We are a world at war yet again. We are a world where, and I think the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis highlights this, capitalism itself seems to be breaking down and eating itself. When energy companies can make billions of pounds of profits at the same time as passing on astronomical price rises to consumers. And of course, we're living through a global ecological crisis where the world itself is heating and burning and breaking down. And then local crises. How do these three levels work out at the local level in your local context? I wonder what they look like and feel like where you are in your church community and in your neighborhoods. Now, that's a fairly gloomy picture. And when a body is sick, it's helpful to have some kind of diagnosis, a bit of a sense of what might be going on. And here are just three of many to offer. The post-colonial theorist Paul Gilroy talks about post-imperial melancholia in Britain. Part of our national identity crisis, he says, is a failure to acknowledge that the empire is over, a failure to grieve its loss, but also a failure to acknowledge that it was in many ways an evil and destructive thing, rather than the glorious thing that some of our superficial history tells us. So a failure to grieve, stuck in melancholia, and a failure to acknowledge the grimness of some of our history. A second diagnosis from the eco-scientist Glenn Albrecht talks about solastalgia, a term he's coined for the distress that's produced by environmental change impacting on people while they're directly connected to their home environment. A homesickness while your home is falling apart around you, coupled with a sense of powerlessness to resist what feels unavoidable. And then a third diagnosis from Otto Scharmer, a systems theorist and psychologist, amongst other things. He talks about three dimensions of things falling apart: a sense of accelerated breakdown and collapse in our environment and in our institutions and societies, a sinking feeling of overwhelm and despair. He highlights that 1 in 8 people across the globe struggle with mental health struggles. That's within the last 10 years. And then thirdly, a gap between knowing and doing. We know that something's wrong, but we don't know what to do about it. A lack of capacity, he says, for shared conversation. An inability, as the wise woman suggests, to talk and listen to each other. And I want to suggest, as others have, that a lot of what we're living through is what we might call collective trauma. Collective because it is shared, even if it is unevenly and unjustly distributed. We are, as they say, all in the same storm, even if we're not all in the same boat. Or as the Anglican priest and author Azariah France Williams puts it, the ship is sinking, but those on the lower decks are drowning first. So collective trauma, it's shared, but it's unevenly distributed. And when human beings live with trauma, live with crisis, we have some familiar responses. Psychologists name them flight, fight, freeze, and force. And you may be able to think of some other F words that might apply as well. Flight, we want to escape. Fight, we want to beat the enemy, whoever or whatever the enemy is. Freeze, we get stuck like a rabbit in the headlights of a car. And force, we try to take control. We try to fix the problem. And oddly enough, if we think through our Christian doctrine and our Christian history, you may notice some of those trauma responses as uncannily close to some of our narratives of salvation. How often in Christian history have we talked about heaven as an escape to a better place? A sense that this world is done for, corrupt, dangerous, scary, but heaven is the good place that we end up in. Alongside that, many early Christian salvation narratives talked about salvation as victory over the enemy of Satan, the enemy of death. And then perhaps some more recent salvation narratives in the church, and I speak only from the experience of the Church of England, although you may be able to nod or comment if this rings bells for you. Freeze. In the face of institutional anxiety and uncertainty about the future, a sense of needing to dig in, to keep doing what we've always done. A sense that somehow, if we have enough resilience, we can weather the storm. A sense that we just need to keep that stiff upper lip and somehow things will be okay. Or force. And here I'm thinking more of gardening than anything else. And I'm not an expert gardener, but I understand that forcing plants, sticking them in a hothouse or a greenhouse, can make them grow fast when otherwise they might not. But there are side effects of forced growth. Often the plants that grow are not very healthy and often don't last very long. I wonder if you recognize some of those responses in yourself, in your communities, in the institutions that you're part of. All of them are natural responses. All of them are very human responses to crisis and trauma. And they link to what Ruth and I, in our book Being Interrupted, call missional economies. And by economies, I don't just mean where the money goes, although that is often telling, but I mean systems that we inhabit, that we feel part of and that feel all-consuming. Economies shape our imaginations. They shape what we are concerned about, what we're worried about, what we value. They shape what we do and how our interactions go. And again, from my particular context and my particular institution, I want to describe two economies that I recognise in the church today as responses to the world that we're living in. The context that I come from is Hodge Hill, as Rachel said, on the east side of Birmingham, just under the M6 motorway, and a place that, in some ways of telling the story, is a place of economic deprivation. I find the Church Urban Fund's web of poverty quite a helpful way of describing the different dimensions of poverty. They talk about a poverty of resources that could be measured in terms of low income, poor education, poor health, a lack of qualifications. They talk about a poverty of relationships, isolation and breakdown between people. But they also talk about a poverty of identity. And in Church Urban Fund's terms, that is often described in individual terms, a lack of well-being, lack of self-worth, poor mental health, for example. But certainly in the community that I know best here on the Furs and Bromford estate, that poverty of identity is also a collective thing. We are a place that is described, as you can see in those headlines, as work shy, as a broken ghetto. And when that kind of language is used by the media and politicians about us, the danger is that people live here begin to believe that about themselves. When I first arrived here, this was a place that many neighbours described as feeling done to, promised the world and then abandoned, or just ignored, overlooked, forgotten about. That kind of poverty of identity is something that sticks and is sticky and can weigh us down. And so how, in contexts like mine, and indeed in all kinds of other contexts, how does the church respond? Well, economy number one, we might call an economy of counting in. In this world, in this way of shaping our imaginations, what matters most is what comes into church. And the kind of things that we can count into church are primarily people and money. And so in this economy, we focus on counting people in and counting money in. And at the heart of this economy is an anxiety that there is a gap or even a gaping hole at the heart of the church that needs filling. It needs filling with people and it needs filling with money. But note what this does to our relationships with our neighbours. In this economy, those of us associated with the church, the danger is that we go out of church and look at our neighbours primarily as things to fill the gap, as things to fill the hole, as things to count into church, and ideally as things that bring money with them as well. Note what that does to how we relate to, interact with, perceive our neighbours. So that's economy number one. Economy number two, we might call the economy of giving out. And in some ways, this is the exact opposite of the first economy. In this, we're much less interested in what comes into church, and we're much more interested in what goes out from church. In this economy, we talk about the growth of the kingdom of God in our neighbourhoods, perhaps, and we, the church, go out from the church building to love and serve our neighbours. Now, lots of that might sound really wonderful and positive, but this too has its dangers. And the dangers mostly are that we move the anxiety we move the sense of gap or lack or hole from within the church to within our neighbourhood. You might notice that some of the figures in this picture look rather sad, and they might be, but this might also be something that we project onto them. In this economy, our neighbours are lacking something. Our neighbourhoods are lacking something that we have to bring them. And we might pause here for a moment to think a bit about Jesus's temptations in the desert. You might remember that in Jesus's baptism, he was affirmed by God as God's beloved child, that God was well pleased with him. And immediately after Jesus' baptism, he is slung out into the desert and he is tempted. And at least in Matthew's version of the temptations, each of the three temptations begin with the words, "If you are the Son of God." If you are. An identity crisis, a questioning of his identity. Prove yourself by doing this. The first temptation, to turn stones into bread, we might call the temptation to the power of the provider. In this temptation, our neighbours we see as hungry, as lacking, and we have something to give them, often a very practical something: food, support. All of this, of course, is necessary, but it's also dangerous. It's seductive. Because if you spend a 6-hour shift at the food bank handing out food parcels to hungry people, it might just be conceivable that at the end of the day, you go home and feel good about yourself. You've done something valuable and worthwhile. You've fed hungry people. And you might go back to the food bank the next week and look forward to your shift to be able to do the same again and to be able to have that slightly warm, fuzzy feeling inside at the end of the day. And the danger of that is that perversely, somewhere along the way, if there was a day when no one came to the food bank, you might feel a little bit sad and disappointed. That warm, fuzzy feeling might no longer be there. You might actually be wanting hungry people to be coming into the food bank so that you can feed them. And of course, there is something perverse and ridiculous about that, because what we really want is for people not to be hungry anymore. The temptation to the power of the provider can be seductive. There is also, as shown by Jesus, and the temptation to throw himself off the temple tower and let the angels catch him, there is also the temptation to the power of the performer, to do things, to be seen, to be doing good. Maybe if people see us do this, they'll believe in God and they'll come to church. I wonder how many of us live streaming through the worst of the lockdown of the pandemic might just occasionally have noticed the number of likes or the number of watches of whatever we produced on a Sunday morning. I might have felt a bit disappointed if there were less likes and a bit elated if there were more. Again, this can be seductive. And lastly, the bow down before me and all this shall be yours temptation, the power of the possessor, to be in control. And this kind of sums up the others as well. How often, I wonder, have we found ourselves slipping into saying or thinking, this is our space, this is our project, this is our church. And we know that if we run it, it will be run well. And yes, we're up for welcoming people, but they need to know how to do it properly. They need to know how to play by our rules. Our territory, our control. Again, it can be a seductive temptation. But note what each of these three temptations do to our relationship with our neighbours. If we're the provider, they're the recipient. If we're the performer, they're the audience. If we're the possessor, are they the possessed? So I'm going to pause there for 10 minutes or so, and I'd like to open up the chat for comments. Where does this ring bells for you so far? What I've described in terms of the crises, that sense of trauma and response, and some of those two missional economies that I'm suggesting might dominate the way we think about church and mission. What do you notice? What rings bells for you? What questions does it stir in you? Pop some comments in the chat, and hopefully we can open up for some people to talk out loud. Rachel's saying the sense of collapse speeding up, like watching water go down the plug hole, spiraling quickly at the end. Elizabeth saying the challenge of resisting anxiety is a driving force. Kim saying warm space is seen as an opportunity to get people in. So keep putting comments in the chat, but Elizabeth, would you like to say a bit more about your comment?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I suppose it's noticing how anxiety was in both of those missional economies, and it's almost a negative thing to use as a driving force. And sometimes, yeah, I get that as a church minister and looking at accounts and reducing numbers and all that, totally get that. But also that having if we let anxiety be our driving force rather than actually wanting to do this for the right reasons, then we're never going to end up in a healthy place, are we? But the opposite of that, or the truth of that, is actually a real vulnerability in letting go, and the grief and everything which comes with that. So it's but sort of naming it as an anxiety in both models is quite helpful, I find.
Great, thank you. Gabriel, would you like to say something about saying the dangers of both counting and giving out approaches to mission?
As I was listening there, for me, it became clear that we were much more focused on what we are doing or what we are asking people to do, but somehow it felt as if we had lost sight of the people who we are trying to bring in terms of their own response to both those approaches of counting in and the approach of giving out. And somehow it started me thinking that maybe somewhere in between those two kind of extreme approaches is something that we need to do.
Thank you. Thank you. So is there a middle ground somewhere? Thank you. Kim, do you want to say something about warm spaces and the temptation that might come with them?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really in what I said. The language is very difficult. If you can see a genuine opportunity to form new relationships with people, that might go all sorts of places and be truly missional by opening churches to people who wouldn't normally come. However, to be seen to be making people warm in order that the church may grow is sort of, you know, it's a real dilemma. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess we need to acknowledge that we come at everything that we do with a mix of motivations, don't we? And some of this is about just trying to bring to the foreground some of what may be going on in our minds and hearts, so that we're more aware of them, and that we get a better sense of which of them is driving us the most. Couple of comments around power. So Dennis and Diana, and also James, mentioned power. And would one of you like to say a bit more?
Yeah, I'll say, Miss James. I think just ultimately, I think it is about power and control. So the idea of doing to other people means that we're the ones that are in control. We're the ones that have the power in that relationship. And I guess some of this is historical, because you know, we are told, or we read about, or we're told, and we reminisce about the great days when there were, you know, 700 people in the Sunday school and all that sort of stuff within the church, those kind of rose-tinted spectacles. But I do think that there is something seductive about being in control. And there is something seductive in saying, well, and I guess it was, and to a certain extent, it you know, that idea of, you know, the power of the provider, and if we're not careful, we do get that warm fuzzy feeling, but we do like to be in control, I think is where I'm coming from. Even if we don't admit it, I think is also the other issue. But
yeah,
so
absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, Dennis here. I agree with what James has just said. I think there's also the seduction of the church, that whereas originally the church was a subversive movement, we've become almost an agent of the powerful. And so that, for example, the government see food banks as a useful answer to poverty, and we can then be seduced, as you were saying about the good feelings of being part of the food bank, into thinking that we are the solution, rather than asking the awkward questions about why people are hungry in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. And that points to both the kind of internal drivers in some of this, but also some of the external pressures as well. That actually not only do we feel like we're doing something valuable, but also actually it's something that maybe acquires funding because the government think it's a good idea, but actually the danger is that we're co-opted into a government agenda that we might have all kinds of questions about, for example. I'm interested in the little bit of conversation between Stephen Allen and Rachel that's emerging here. Something about reflecting on where and who we've been, and going through the different, does going through economy 1 to then become economy 2 make economy 1 wrong? Stephen, do you want to just say a bit more about what you mean there?
Oh yes, I think we always care, but I think sometimes we care within our own environment, as opposed to going out into the community. And I think sometimes, I guess, I was reflecting on the fact that sometimes we see a need and we think we can fulfil that need within our own buildings, and therefore we go through a process of thinking, are our buildings sufficient to meet that need, and we go out with you know, and focus on structure and funding. But once we've done that, we can then, I guess, spend that time on that, using our buildings for the community and absolutely concentrate on that. But we've had to go through that process of, if you like, economy 1 to be able to achieve economy 2. Sometimes, I guess, you know, as Rachel said, we can look back on our decision and say, I guess, reflect on how we've gone about things, and we've gone about things in the right way. But it's just something that I thought was important to raise and just think about, really.
Yeah, thank you. And please don't hear an excessive bit of judgment in what I'm saying in describing these two economies, because I think both of them have their place, particularly within the institutional aspects of church, but also in terms of the way we seek to love our neighbours. I think what I'm just trying to flag up is that each of them comes with their dangers, and that comes with their anxieties as well. Rachel, did you want to come back on some of this?
Yeah, only reflecting that I mean, most of us in this room have been in church for a very long time, and all that time we've been trying to be good followers of Jesus Christ. And so I think it's that fact that when you're inhabiting a sort of inherited model, and this is the way we do things and so on and so forth, it's just the way you do things. And it often does require, I've just thought of the title of your book as a way of describing this. It does need a sort of interruption. It needs something to come in just to make us stop and reflect, because we just tend to assume that the way things are done are the way things should be done. And so we often need somebody else outside the system to sort of point out the fact that, yes, there are good things to it, but there are temptations, and you know, there's that power, and how we're using it we need to really look at. So
yeah, brilliant, thank you. If it's okay, I'm going to move on at this point to think a little bit about our possible responses and how we might shift them. So I'm just minimizing the various things on my screen so I can see what I'm talking about. Otto Sharma, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a very interesting article just a couple of weeks ago, which I've got a reference to at the end. And this is particularly in response to the climate crisis, but I think it applies to other things as well. He describes a bit of a stages of response, a bit of a journey that some of you might recognize as similar to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. He talks about a first stage that is rooted in denial, sticking our heads in the sand. There isn't a problem. He describes a second stage that he calls distancing. It's their fault, not mine, whoever they are. Often the people at the centre or at the top or whatever, or sometimes the people at the edge, the others. He describes a third stage that he calls depression, particularly with the ecological crisis. It's all too late. We've gone past the point of no return. What can we do? And he suggests that beyond those three stages, there might be a fourth stage. I'm calling it diving deep. Otto Sharma calls it deep sensing and co-creativity, but an invitation to dive deep into the reality, to dive deep into ourselves, into our relationships, into our neighborhoods. I think ultimately this is the only way to go. We need to open our eyes and our hearts, to let them break, perhaps, so that we can begin to face the reality in front of us and around us. And so what might that look like? One of the writers that I have found most influential over the last decade or so is a feminist theorist called Donna Haraway. She wrote a book a few years ago called Staying with the Trouble. And even the title, I think, is a helpful one. To find ways of staying with the trouble, resisting the various heroic, future-oriented temptations towards what she calls clearing away the present and the past in order to make an imagined future safe for coming generations. To avoid that kind of clearing away, but instead, she says, learning to be truly present as mortal critters in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings, with the clear and present aim of intentional kin-making across deep damage and significant difference. I'm going to repeat that last phrase because I think it's the critical one. With the clear and present aim of intentional kin-making across deep damage and significant difference. She's talking about making kin not just across the human species, but across boundaries of species with some of our fellow creatures with whom we share the planet, but making kin with our creatures. Staying with the trouble. A second image I want to offer you is from trauma theorist Shelley Rambo. Shelley Rambo goes in depth in her book Spirit and Trauma into the experience of trauma and what it does to our understanding of time, our sense that the past doesn't stay in the past but keeps on coming back and invading the present, and a sense that the future is one where we don't leave behind the past, but is one where the past stays with us, and where survival is not a stage in which one gets beyond death, beyond loss, beyond trauma, but a future is one in which we remain, in which our past remains with us. And somehow, rather than thinking about getting over or moving beyond, rather than the various re's of rebuilding, restoring, recovering, we need to attend more to what it means to remain, to stay with the trouble, as Donna Haraway says, to dwell in the midst of the experience of crisis and trauma, to attend to its effects, but also to look for hope and love and life within it. And so Shelley Rambo points us to the space between cross and resurrection, what the Christian tradition calls the Holy Saturday space between Good Friday and Easter Day, and to look for a new way of being, a form of life that's not triumphant, but is about love remaining, love making its way through death. And she talks about tracking the undertow and sensing life in that space. The undertow, as in at the coast, at the beach. Those of you who've been sort of bodyboarding or even swimming in the sea might have noticed this, experienced it, and felt some of its power. The underlying current that lies beneath the surface of the water, that pulls in the opposite direction, a pull that's not visible but can have great force. She invites us, Shelley Rambo does, to track the undertow, to notice the forces that insist on trying to pull us under, discerning what doesn't rise to the surface, the force of institutions and persons that do not want certain truths to be told. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, what Shelley Rambo calls sensing life recalls Jesus' promise that the Spirit will lead the disciples into truth. Jesus tells the disciples that they won't understand the events that will take place, but they will in the Spirit be guided in relationship to them. the life that is to be sensed is not miraculously new, but is a mixed and tenuous process of remaining. The Spirit's witness is, she says, to forms of life that are less discernible, more inchoate and tenuous than visible and secure. These barely discernible forms of life bubble up, we might say, even as the undertow's downward pull persists. Sensing requires imagination, an encounter with what is not yet fully recognizable or graspable. So I wonder, where are we sensing life, even as we notice the undertow dragging us down? And again, back to Otto Scharmer. When systems collapse, he says, what are we left with? We're left with each other. We're left with our relationships. We know that the solution to our problems in this century isn't big government, it's not big money, and it's not big tech either. We do need all three. We need government, we need capital, we need technology. But what we need most of all is a profound shift in our qualities of relationship that allow us to protect and tend the flame. We need what he calls circles of radical presence, which from someone who's not explicitly Christian may have a certain kind of Christian ring about it, or at least Christianity as we may have sometimes occasionally glimpsed it. And my fourth and final witness here is the Franciscan scholar Gillian Algren, who talks about the spirituality of St. Francis and St. Clare in these terms. For Francis and Clare, encounter became an arresting way of life, open to all. In their experience, there was no one whose life would not be deeply enriched by deeper dedication to the way of encounter. Engaging the other with the intention to listen, to learn, and to connect is a mutually transformative practice that slowly changes everything. Encounter teaches us to honor the fragility and sacredness of our own humanity, especially as we come to know our common humanity together. When done in the conscious presence of the love of God, encounter creates sacred space in the human community. Encounter moves us from observers of life to collaborators with God in the building up of the human community, the creation of a common home. Now, all of that is fine and wonderful and inspiring language, but what does it mean in practice? I want to describe briefly what Ruth and I in our book call a third economy of treasure seeking and of being interrupted. It's an economy that involves going out from church and involves welcoming into church, but in a different way, in quite a mindset shift from economies 1 and 2. Because in this economy, we go out not with full hands ready to give our needy neighbours something that we have, but with empty hands, with open eyes and hands and hearts, looking for treasure in our neighbourhoods, ready to receive the gifts and the challenges of our neighbours. And that is what comes back into church with us. Not perhaps what our strategies say we must bring in, but what we unexpectedly receive in our encounters with our neighbours. The gifts that they want to offer us, the challenges that they want to present to us, challenges perhaps that question our prejudices, that enlarge our horizons, that turn our imaginations upside down. The kind of challenge that the Syrophoenician woman presented Jesus when she asked for bread and he said no. The kind of gift that the woman, the unnamed woman with the ointment, presented Jesus with when she broke open her jar and poured it over his head. How might we, with Jesus, receive those gifts and challenges from our neighbours in ways that change us. Gifts of stories, gifts of wisdom, gifts of skills and knowledge and experience that our neighbours have, that they want to share with us. Gifts that, if only we can find the right way of unlocking them, of saying yes to them, might unleash untold power in our neighbourhoods and among our neighbours. Well, one way we might begin to unearth and unleash those gifts is by finding the connectors in our neighbourhoods. The connectors are not necessarily, and often not, the community leaders, not the people up the front of the meeting with the loudest voices, but the people in the middle of the room, the people who know everybody and who are known in turn and are trusted. The people that you cross the road to have a conversation with rather than cross the road to avoid. The people who know the person down the road who needs some help, and who know the person in the other direction who maybe could be the person that is ideally suited to give that help. The people who know the person who needs their grass cutting, and who also knows the person with a bit of time on their hands and a lawnmower who might be free to do it. The connectors in our neighbourhood are the people we need to find who will lead us to others. And then the bumping spaces in our neighbourhoods, the places where people bump into each other, encounter each other naturally without us having to do anything. It just happens from day to day. It could be the school gate, it could be the barber shop, it could be the betting shop, it could be the park where the dog walkers bump into each other. Who knows? But the bumping spaces of our neighbourhoods are the places where, if we dare to hang out in them, we will guarantee to find treasure and, yes, be interrupted. And if we go out into our neighbourhoods looking for those places, looking for those people, open to those gifts, we will discover a power within our communities, which we as Christians must say is the power of the Holy Spirit at work before us and around us. It is a power that can be found in gatherings beyond our control, in stories that are not our stories, in an action for change which is there before we arrive on the scene. But it is a power that we can join in with, not to make all the difference because the Christians have arrived on their white horses, but to change us, as well as bring our contribution and our gifts to change others too. It is the power of encounter that Gillian Algren described in The Spirituality of Francis and Clare. So finally, what might it look like to go on this journey, to shift the mindset, to inhabit the third economy as well as the first two? Well, I can guarantee you that it will be a slow journey. We talk often in our work here about going at the speed of trust. I can guarantee you that the most significant things that happen will be small rather than big. And they will be fragile. They will often be broken and they will break. They will often be here today and perhaps gone tomorrow. But that does not mean that the effort has been wasted. And I can guarantee you that those things will be uncontrollable and unpredictable. Uncontrollable by us, uncontrollable by anybody. But in those things is their subversive value and the sign that the Spirit of Christ is at work. Some of you may have come across an amazing book that was written miraculously just before the pandemic of COVID, when none of us knew where we were going, by Susan Beaumont, called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. And she describes in it 3 transitions, which she borrowed from Otto Scharmer, who I've mentioned once or twice already. The transition of learning to have an open mind, of suspending judgment, of letting go of our need to know, and of entering into a spirituality of unknowing. The transition to having an open heart, of shifting our perspective from advocating our agenda to paying attention to what is going on around us. And an open will, of letting go of our agenda and of our striving to implement it, to a sense of surrender to what is happening to us and around us, to what is coming to us as gift and as challenge. And lastly, I want to suggest that in all of this, and in our theologies of salvation and resurrection, we might do worse than pay attention to the compost heap. The compost heap is where the waste ends up, where the things that we believe we are done with end up. The compost heap is where a whole load of stuff that is rigid gets broken down, where a whole load of different things get thrown together. And in the breaking down and the thrown togetherness, and in the creepy crawlies that we'd rather avoid but actually turn out to be essential to the process, something miraculous happens. The stuff that we have thrown away, that we thought was waste and no longer needed, turns into dark, rich soil within which new life springs up. When we are used as churches to talking and hearing the language of growth, we need also to pay attention to what is decomposing, the other side of the cycle of life, which is equally essential. So I wonder, what is decomposing in us, in our communities, in our nation and in our world? What needs to decompose? What needs to be broken down and broken up and broken open? And what in the midst of that decomposition, which is often smelly and unsavory, what in the midst, where in the midst is life springing up? That is pretty much me done. But again, we have a bit of space for responses, comments, questions, and I suggest 3 of my own to maybe shape your wondering at this point. What do you notice? How is this making you feel? What do you realize? Are there penny drop moments here? And what do you wonder? What questions are stirring for you? So again, let's start by putting some stuff in the comments, and then we'll open it up for a bit of conversation before I hand over to others. Alan, would you like to say a bit about your comment about busyness?
Bless you. Thank you for your thoughts and reflections. Very, very helpful to us. I'm sure it's true in all churches, but certainly in Methodism, we sometimes seem to define ourselves by how busy we are. I read a paper many years ago about Methodism having a spirituality of busyness, i.e. it is okay to express our faith in busyness. But it seems to me the heart of what you're calling us to reflect on is stopping and not being afraid of that in the midst of a drive to try and save or fill the gap in our church or our church life or our money or our people or all of those things. So that we might come alongside the communities around us, and in doing so come alongside them in the right way and for the right reasons. There's lots of layers, aren't there? So I suppose the skill is how do we stop and listen? That's a good starting place for me. I'm not sure how to do it. I just think it's a good place to start.
Thank you. A vital question, I think. Yeah. Gabriel, would you like to say something about yours?
I'm just wondering, and the last one just caught my attention, that compost analogy. That sometimes we are afraid of things that are dying or of transitioning from one form to another. And I started wondering whether, as we think about where we go, we might think about new ways of being church that are springing out of the old ways that are dying, and how we probably use the compost to feed these new ways and new structures that will define what church will be as we go forward.
Thank you. That's a generative and important wondering. Thank you. Joanne, do you want to say a bit more about the ecological alongside the economic?
I was afraid you'd ask, Al. So it comes with the first confession. I wasn't being entirely flippant with big ideas come from sitting under big trees, but because I was already thinking of kind of some of this ecological stuff. I think there are lots of metaphors that we can use for this, which move us away from counting people and money, and which can help us stop perpetuating injustices if we start to look at models of rewilding, reforesting, coppicing, and this sort of more ecological language. I love the compost theology and that sense of needing death in order to bring life. The risk with economic models is that we're still using a broken system. Whereas if we have creation at the heart of our theology, it is the beginning and the end of our Holy Scripture, for example, then actually that gives us stronger models that rely on humanity not having all the answers and being part of the problem rather than always having the solutions.
Thank you. It's really powerful. There's lots there. Rachel, do you want to share a couple of your wonderings there?
Yeah, there were a couple of wonderings. One is that, and we used to do this as a family. I grew up going to church. You know, we'd get in the car and we'd drive across Stoke-on-Trent to where my mum and dad grew up, but we didn't live there anymore. And I think that's not uncommon amongst Methodist people, that quite often quite a large proportion of the people don't actually live in the neighbourhood. And so I'm wondering, this moving to this economy feels like needing to be really in touch and part of the community in which the church is based. So I was wondering about that. And also we have such a very, very strong image of going out from church, you know, holding the gospel, the good news of Jesus in our hands to give. And I'm absolutely sure that's not incompatible with going out empty-handed. But I am wondering how those two fit together. Yeah, I might waffle out, you know, I might posit a few answers of my own, but I think I'm just going to leave it there. I'm just interested in how those two fit together.
Yeah, thank you. Again, really important questions. Any other wonderings or responses? Paul, would you like to say a bit more about what you've just posted there?
Yes, I find that concept of the Holy Saturday very, very helpful, mainly because we don't dwell there. We want to move from the Good Friday and jump to the resurrection as if Saturday is not there. That space where despair and a sense of loss, that theology of compost is, I find that mainly because it's not a comfortable place to be, and we try to avoid exploring that and being aware of what is in the Holy Saturday.
Thank you. A number of you in your comments have pointed us towards the importance of dwelling, abiding in our neighbourhoods with the experience of crisis in that Holy Saturday space, paying attention to what's going on around us, paying attention to the work of the Spirit. And my time is up, but I think I want to leave you with that as an invitation. What are the ways in which you can abide, remain, pay attention, and respond out of that place?
Al, thank you so much. This is one of these presentations where by the end of it, I have infinitely more questions than I had at the beginning. But I think that's a really good thing to say, that you've left me thinking, okay, so I thought I had a handle on that, but I wonder how that works now. So thank you so much for bringing that to us, to say there's some diving deep there. We haven't had very long. This is really mind-shifting stuff to get your head around. We want to just make an invitation. It's an invitation, not a compulsion, that if you'd like to talk with other people a bit more about this, then about 10 minutes after we've gone from lunch, we will open up a meeting room so that you can maybe bring your sandwich, bring your cup of tea, and we can just have an informal chat in a meeting room together over what we've heard. But thank you very much, and we pray for you and your ministry, and we pray for the people of the Firs estate and for Hodge Hill Church. But thank you. Al says he's happy to stay around for that for a bit, so that's great. That's a wonderful inducement. And now I'm going to